Well, we're back in the library. And today, before we tell you the book, let's begin with, do you know what Christian nationalism is? You've heard me preach about it from time to time. Probably hear about it in the news with some regularity. It's a form of nationalism where people who are Christians would like their faith to dominate politically and culturally all other voices. I think that's a fair description of it. It's not healthy. It's not healthy for Christianity for sure, and it's not helpful to the nation as well. And a lot of writers the last 10 years have been trying to get their minds around this, the history of Christian nationalism, the influence of it, the possible results of it if practiced. And you can see a lot of different books out there. You can Google after this is over and find you a few to read. I have one on my shelf that I have found very interesting by Tim Alberta. Tim Alberta, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. And it is about sort of a more recent history of Christian nationalism and a description of why it is destructive or unhealthy to our country or to any country. And I have a few quotes from it that I'm going to talk about, if I can find them. As a child, I was taught that the things of this world are temporary, and the only things that really matter are those things that are eternal. Christian nationalism sort of twists that around to make it seem like all that's important is power and influence, and eternity is not nearly as important as presently being able to be in charge. And so Tim Alberta, who grew up as an evangelical conservative, grew up in suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, has a great pedigree for talking about this subject. If you'd like to look him up, Tim Alberta writes, "Instead of fixing our eyes on the unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is eternal is unseen, as St. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, we, in the 21st century, have become fixated on the here and now. Instead of seeing ourselves as exiles, the way Peter described the first century Christians living in Rome, we have embraced our imperial citizenship. We are the Romans. Instead of fleeing the temptation to rule the world as Jesus did, we have made deals with the devil to be in power, to have charge. So we're not really practicing our faith. We're just trying to assess power. On page 242, he writes, I've come to believe that the Christ of the gospel has become a moral stranger to us. If you read the gospels, the things that profoundly matter to Christ, they marginally matter to most evangelical Christians, like poverty and alienation and imprisonment. Those are all things that Jesus talked at length about, but they're marginalized by the evangelical church. They're marginalized by the church. Jesus, they were important to. And the things that really profoundly matter to them, the modern Christian church, marginally matter to Christ. In other words, we make mountains out of molehills. We put points of emphasis where Jesus never put a point of emphasis. And we ignore the things that Jesus talked about relentlessly, like poverty and how to address poverty and what to do about poverty. Christian nationalism raises issues that are minimal in the scripture. And they minimize things that are spoken about widely. So they misrepresent, really, what Christianity is all about. On page 256, George Orwell, the author of Animal Farm in 1984, said, here's the difference. Patriotism is naturally defensive, both militarily and culturally. Nationalism, on the other hand, is inseparable from a desire for power. See, that's sort of the crux of it, isn't it? Jesus came to serve. He came to teach us to serve. He told us the first will be last. And yet all the Christian church does in the modern era is try to get power. We don't lead by serving. And Tim Alberta points out the dangers of this. The dangers of becoming Christian nationalist and losing focus on the Christ of Scripture. One thing you hear repeatedly in this book, and I hear repeatedly when I hear other people preach, is they talk about a biblical worldview. That's what we need to adopt, is a biblical worldview. I don't know what Bible they're reading. I just don't. The biblical worldview, they had multiple wives. The biblical worldview was that women are property. And I'm astonished that they don't understand that people like me, we want to follow Jesus's worldview. And we learn about Jesus's worldview in the Bible, of course. But it's not a biblical worldview. It's a Jesus's worldview. And the reason why they don't want us to talk about Jesus is because they know Jesus would oppose Christian nationalism. He was all for lifting up the marginalized, lifting up the broken, dealing with poverty. He wasn't about ignoring any of that. He didn't make mountains out of molehills like we do. He concentrated on the things that really mattered. And I suppose that's the most destructive thing about Christian nationalism, is that it takes the narrative away from the things that really matter to some very inconsequential issues that have very little to do with faith, very little to do with the nation, and very little to do with the Bible. So pick up a copy. Tim Alberta, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory.